It's the week ending Saturday, the 12th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accusing Russia of war crimes for bombing a Mariupol maternity hospital, McDonald's, Coca-Cola and Starbucks suspending operations in Russia following pressure on social media, and the discovery of Shackleton's Endurance shipwreck 107 years after it sank. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, we have Joe Evans, from the Week Junior editor Felicity Capon, and from Goal, it's Emma Smith. Joe, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Illiberal measures for liberal means.
According to German weekly Der Spiegel, intelligence agents will be allowed to shadow the party, tap its communications, use undercover informants and scrutinise funding. The move follows a 2-year investigation outlined in a report containing some 1,000 pages of evidence. It includes speeches and statements made by AfD members at all levels, which are expected to provide evidence that the party undermines democratic values. The party has employed openly anti-Islamic and anti-establishment rhetoric. Also under scrutiny are party members affiliated with a radical but now dissolved faction of the AfD, as well as its links to right-wing extremist organisations.
Mario Sofos reporting for France 24 last year. Joe, what happened then and what's happening now?
So what is happening now is that a German court has ruled that the far-right Alternative for Germany party can be classified as a suspected threat to democracy. What this does is paves the way for the domestic intelligence agency in Germany to essentially spy on the party. The court dismissed a legal challenge that was brought by the AfD last March that delayed plans by Germany's Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution to put the party under surveillance. The court in Cologne found that there was sufficient indications of anti-constitutional goals within the AfD, and as a result, the BFV, which is the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, is allowed to classify the party as anti-Islam, anti-immigrant, and as a suspected case of right-wing extremism.
Okay, a lot of acronyms going on there, so let's just spool back a little bit. So AfD, far-right party, can now be investigated by the domestic intelligence agency in Germany. I mean, they may be a far-right party, but they are a mainstream political party there, like it or not. They were the official opposition, weren't they, until last year's election. How is this being received?
So yeah, as you say, the AfD see themselves as a legitimate far-right political party. They hold 81 seats in the Bundestag. It has fallen in the polls in recent years from around 17% in sort of mid-2018 to around 9% now. In Germany's federal election last year, it lost 11 seats. The position of the AfD is, as I say, that they're a legitimate party of the right, and they have obviously responded with outrage at the suggestion that they can be surveilled by intelligence services. But nonetheless, this new classification authorises German intelligence to tap the party's communications and also deploy undercover informants to find out more about how the party operates.
I mean, Felicity, if this happened in the UK, or, I mean, if it happened in America, can you imagine? It would be considered the antithesis of democracy and freedom, wouldn't it? That if you run a political party, no matter how nefarious the members are that are in it, you should not be being investigated by the government's own agencies.
Well, I think wherever it's happening, I think it's the antithesis of democracy in Germany. You can slightly understand it more so in Germany, I think, based on Germany's more recent history and its sort of ongoing struggle and its legacy with Nazism and the sort of neo-Nazi elements in this party, and the sort of idea that it's, you know, Germany will want to be seen to be cracking down on this kind of rhetoric and activity that is pretty unpleasant. But I just can't really see what good this does. I mean, the idea of surveilling politicians in the Bundestag seems completely outrageous. If you're a member of the party, I think I read that, you know, if you're a civil servant or something, this could really kind of cost you your job and you might have to kind of quit the party. I think it's going to create a lot of rancor and unhappiness. I think also the idea of who is the agency run by, it's quite easy for the AfD to then play the victim card and say that this is a political thing, because actually I think the agency is kind of full of Christian Democratic Union Party members. So you could sort of spin this as just a political thing to kind of stamp out the opposition. I mean, so the whole thing, I think, is pretty undemocratic. You know, just because a party is unpalatable to you, it doesn't mean that you can sort of take these quite draconian steps.
I mean, Emma, from your point of view in sports reporting, far-right politics, as we've discussed on the show before, does spill into violence, doesn't it, on the terraces, racist chants, that sort of thing. So do you have some sympathy with the German government's desire to keep far-right groups under observation, even if they're the very groups that are in the Bundestag?
I guess to a certain extent you can understand it, because Germany has had significant issues, obviously, in its recent history with far-right movements, and there have been terror attacks as a result of far-right anti-Islam politics. It does seem extremely heavy-handed to effectively make wiretapping, use of informants, undercover action sort of legal.
It's also interesting, isn't it, Joe? Both Felicity and Emma have made reference to, Germany's particular special relationship with far-right politics because of basically the outcome of the Second World War. But this also is resonant of what happened in Germany under communism in East Germany, isn't it? I mean, that's the problem. They also have history with surveillance of this sort and not having a happy outcome there too.
Absolutely, and Germany is very sensitive with regards to civil liberties, given that history, as has been mentioned, first with Nazi rule, and then, as you raised, in the former East, the experience of people living under Soviet surveillance. It's depicted in the film Das Leben der Anderen, in which a Stasi, East Germany's secret police officer, traces and tracks people because they're suspected of trying to undermine the state. The issue here, I think, is the German constitution, as written after the Second World War, puts in its first line references the importance of human dignity. The issue that people have with the AfD is that their political project undermines that constitutional goal of always preserving human dignity. One of the things that was mentioned by the judges specifically referenced the De Flügel faction of the party, of which approximately 20% of the AfD's members are also members of this sort of internal faction. And it also made reference to the party's youth wing, which has been increasingly accused of accepting racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and also the downplaying of the Nazis' crimes, which is also a crime in Germany. And so that's really where this has come from. It's this suggestion that actually this is moved from being a sort of legitimate political action from the right and has become something more nefarious that actually kind of breaks the law in Germany. So that's the distinction the court is making.
And actually, Emma, from that point of view, it unquestionably has been the case that the AfD has changed quite dramatically, hasn't it, since it was founded in 2013 as something more analogous to UKIP, really, a kind of anti-Euro outfit and then an anti-EU outfit. It has really lurched to the right since then.
Yeah, it's moved basically from being the German equivalent of UKIP to the German equivalent of the BNP. Moved from sort of being an anti-EU, Eurosceptic party into an actively anti-Islam, anti-immigrant party, and obviously, and then in 2017, winning seats in the national parliament on the back of that. And basically, it's become a party of the disaffected sort of right-wing viewpoints. In the general election last year in Germany, they ran on anti-lockdown policies, for example. What I think things that makes this such a strange move by the German government is the fact that AfD is, in the last couple of years, very much something of a fading force. They got less than 10% of the vote in the last general election, down from around 13% in 2017 when they won seats in the German parliament. So it seems as if a little bit from a government perspective, shutting the door after this horse has bolted.
Which might account, Felicity, for why initially this legislation was put through this time last year, as Joe said, and it's been delayed for a year. I mean, this would have been much more potent a year ago, wouldn't it, ahead of the general election when they were still the official opposition, rather than now, as Emma says, it's coming to action at the point where they seem to be slightly on the wane.
Yeah, they do. On the wane, and also sort of a lot of internal power struggles, and they sort of seem in turmoil anyway. And sort of looking back on like the lifespan so far of the AfD, there's been a lot of power struggles and leaders being ousted because actually they didn't like the direction the AfD was going in, and they were concerned that it was going too far to the right and was too extreme, which I think is interesting, because I think it shows that it's a party that, I mean, I think it was sort of originally set up when Merkel decided to allow a huge influx of Syrian refugees into the country. And actually, whatever you think about that, that's a legitimate grievance that a lot of people in Germany would have had at the time about how it was being handled and managed. That's not a sort of a racist thing in and of itself. It just seems that as the years went by, it increasingly, I guess it's the same with all these movements that, there can be legitimate grievances, but then the party is also attracting people who are overtly xenophobic and racist and all the rest of it. But it also seems, kind of a bit of a battle over language and rhetoric to some degree. There was one of the AfD's leaders at some point, I can't remember exactly when, he likened Germany's Nazi era to a speck of bird shit in more than 1,000 years of successful German history. And to a lot of people, this was an outrageous thing to say, sort of really minimising Nazism. But again, it's just a sort of freedom of speech and freedom of expression type argument. Do you want to kind of air these things that people say and then debate them and take them down, or do you want to sort of ban and surveil them and all that sort of thing? So yeah, it's definitely a party that does seem to be waning and also seems to be in turmoil anyway, I think.
Could this, though, Joe, be the beginning of a bounce back for them, because they can use this to their advantage, can't they, politically, and say, look how the establishment hates us with their base? And you could argue that last year people voted for more centrist-leaning parties because of COVID, and that was echoed all around the world, people wanting establishment-type people to be running the place for a while. And now you have another migration crisis coming from Ukraine, so you could see how they could bounce back.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely right to point out that the AfD are a party on the decline. I think actually that's part of the reason that the court has taken this stance now, because I think the issue here is that the point of Germany's proportional representation political system is that by giving people representation in the Bundestag, that's meant to act as a pressure valve. It's meant to dissipate these feelings of disenfranchisement if you vote for far-right parties, because you can see yourself represented in the Bundestag. The concern in German politics actually is that given that the AfD are on the wane and less people are voting for them, where will these individuals go who still feel very committed to the AfD's cause when the party becomes less and less popular nationally? Will they lash out and express themselves in different ways? Will they stop expressing themselves at the ballot box? The position of the sort of German establishment is that this is the use of a liberal means to protect liberal values, and that isn't an uncommon thing. That's been seen in various different countries throughout history. It's not dissimilar to the principle the British government had during the Cold War, when we had a secret ban on communists in government service, and extensive surveillance of communist workers in government dockyards and ordnance factories and industrial sites in various places. These things aren't uncommon. They are unpalatable to sort of classical liberals who feel that this type of surveillance is unacceptable in any terms, but not actually that uncommon. And I think that would be the position the government would take in Germany, that this is simply a protective measure taken to make sure that the AfD's supporters don't explode in ways that are far more nefarious and dangerous than just ticking a box and voting every 4 years in German federal elections.
Interesting. Okay, Emma, you're up next after this. Okay, Emma, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is football finally coming to terms with sports washing?
Well, if it feels right for the club, then it's the right thing to do. And at the moment, we're seeing it done very regularly across the world, people making decisions. So that's a club decision. And as a coach, as a person, and my staff and the players who work here on the ground, our life hasn't changed very much in a way. So it's very hard for us to go any further than that. We do our jobs. We feel a deep sense of empathy and emotion to things that are happening in the world. That's our I think, human instinct. And then the club have made decisions that I think is the right decision.
Frank Lampard, head coach for Everton now, speaking last week. So Emma, what's happened this week?
So this week has seen continuation of football cutting ties with Russian money and Russian sponsorship amid the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. For example, this week, Robert Lewandowski, one of the most famous footballers in the world, Bayern Munich striker, ended a personal $5 million sponsorship with Huawei, which is believed to have helped the Russians secure their networks against cyber attacks by the Ukraine.
And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it's not a directly Russian company, obviously. You think Huawei and you don't think Russia.
Yeah, but it's coming amid football clubs and famous footballers effectively attempting to cleanse their brands of any potential links to Russia and Russian money, which, considering the ways in which football has tied itself into sponsorship deals, competitions being held in Russia and in other states with mixed records on human rights, and there now seems to be the Russia-Ukraine crisis seems to have caused something of a reckoning within football.
And what was Lampard talking about there with regard to Everton specifically? What's the situation there?
So Everton are one of several clubs across Europe to have cut ties with Russian sponsors. Everton had deals with 3 Russian companies, USM, Megafon and Yota, through its close ties to the oligarch Alisher Usmanov. Usmanov is one of the oligarchs who's been sanctioned for his ties to Vladimir Putin, and so Everton have looked to row back on their sponsorship deals. They've ended the deals with the 3 aforementioned companies. Earlier today, Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich was sanctioned by the UK government, and we've also seen a movement across Europe seemingly to distance itself as quickly as possible from Russia.
Yes, although it's not as if corporate sanctions in response to Russia's war have been underreported exactly, is it? As I said up top, McDonald's leaving Moscow has been headline news. So, I mean, Emma covers this beat, as a reporter. Felicity, do you agree that what's going on in the world of sport is significant? This is something we should be paying more attention to.
I certainly think that the world of culture and sport getting involved in the invasion of Ukraine is very interesting. The economic sanctions are one thing, but then for the Bolshoi Ballet to be targeted, or Disney and Warner Brothers pausing theatrical releases in Russia, I can't really quite work out how I feel about it. Cynical part of me, thinks it's sort of empty virtue signalling, really, and slightly histrionic gestures that won't really amount to very much and isn't particularly helpful to resolving the conflict, but makes companies and football teams suddenly look very good. I think a lot of it will punish ordinary Russians rather than the actions of one autocrat, which I don't really see how that helps. I think there's a lot of Russians who, really don't want this to be happening and feel terrible about it and are being targeted around the world as, sort of public enemy number one, which I'm not sure is helpful, really. And some of it I just think is frankly ludicrous. I think Netflix is pulling an adaptation of Anna Karenina because they've come under pressure to sort of make clear their position. I mean, why anyone cares what Netflix thinks? And I think also the Science Museum will now not run an exhibition on the Trans-Siberian Railway. I mean, this sort of thing, I think it's very sort of our time, that everyone has to get out that they are how they feel about this conflict, where it actually gets us in terms of resolving the conflict. I'd say sort of nowhere, really.
Yeah, I mean, even on a personal level, somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, I think. I've been thinking about this because I like a martini. That's what I drink of an evening, which involves vodka, or it does if you make it properly, in my view. And I just don't think the Polish ones taste as nice as the Russian ones. And I've been thinking, well, should I? This is a very small sacrifice, don't get me wrong. I realise in the grand scheme of what we're talking about, this is not big deal. But I've been thinking, should I be buying the Polish one I don't like as much because I don't want to buy the Russian one because I don't want to be putting any money into Russia at all and the people that run these companies. But then I'm thinking, but there's whole, importers that are based here selling Russian vodka. I would actually be punishing people in Britain that are selling a superior product. I'm effectively cancelling Russians rather than Putin.
A wonderful insight, by the way, into your domestic life, thoroughly. I'm sorry, but you just have to do your duty. That's the way that this works. No, I think that what Felicity has just said is really important, because I think it's very important that we draw a line here between things that will impact ordinary Russians and things that will essentially result in a new Iron Curtain descending across Europe, because Russia will become this sort of pariah state in which no Western products, or Western cultural products at least, are able to reach. And the football side of this, which is very specifically related to money, and Kremlin-linked money specifically. Roman Abramovich has been sanctioned not because it's seen as a way to distance the United Kingdom and Chelsea Football Club from Russia further. He has been sanctioned because he is the majority shareholder in a holding company that supplies steel to the Russian military to build tanks. Now, if that money is flowing into Chelsea Football Club, that type of money needs to be cut off and it needs to be stopped, because quite obviously you don't want people to be able to sport wash their reputation through the ownership of a Premier League football club while simultaneously profiting from the Russian war effort.
Okay, well, let's talk about that then. Sport washings is a phrase that Emma brought up as well, and now you've brought up too. Emma, this is a bigger issue than just Everton and Chelsea, isn't it? And it's a bigger issue than just Russia. You know, there's Qatari money, there's Saudi money, there's Chinese money, all the way through football. And, you know, money related to Putin has been there for years. It's not like Putin suddenly became Putin when he invaded Ukraine. There was Crimea back in 2014. Manchester United was quite happy to renew with Aeroflot then. So this is a big thing, isn't it, if they're actually going to look at all dirty money in football?
Yeah, it seems as if, football has for years and years been happy to sort of take sponsorship from Russia, from Russian companies, while sort of turning a blind eye to the things that you mentioned there, Ollie. And obviously now it's that things have escalated in Ukraine, suddenly it's having to dial back on it. I mean, you can see less than 4 years ago we were at the 2018 World Cup in Russia, and with which Russia was universally sort of lauded for doing a good job and putting on a good show. Later this year, the Champions League final was going to be going to St. Petersburg. Now that has been stripped and moved to Paris. So football has very much been tied up so closely with Russian money, with Russian sponsorship, and is suddenly finding itself in this incredibly morally compromised position where it's having to shed millions of pounds in sponsorship. You know, you mentioned Manchester United there, had 30 million sponsorship across 9 years with Aeroflot, and is now to the extent of trying to distance itself that they're actually digging up their own car park because it's got Aeroflot sponsorship sort of emblazoned across it, because they're so desperate to with their brand of Russian links.
Yes, and there's fan support at the moment, Felicity, because, of course, it's difficult to oppose. No one's going to say, oh, what Russia are doing are brilliant, and I want my football club to have their national airline emblazoned across their car park. Of course, all the fans at the moment seem to be on side with this, but they haven't suffered yet. You know, they haven't seen, as a result of sports washing ending, if that is what's happening, less money to pay for the best players, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's still sort of very early days in the story of this invasion, and I fear it's going to go on for quite a lot longer. But we're sort of at 2 weeks in, and I think there's probably quite a lot of knee-jerk responses and kind of emotional responses. And you're quite right, there's probably a long way to go, and I think people might start feeling differently when it does affect their everyday lives. And, I suppose the big one is how energy prices are going to rise as well in this country, and how people are going to start to feel the pinch, probably because of what's going on. And, food prices around the world is going to be a huge one as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if people start taking a more nuanced and a slightly, start seeing this as a slightly more complicated issue than what it is. But certainly at the moment, I think there's a lot of, it's a very emotive issue, and I'm not trying to suggest that it isn't. And when you hear about maternity wards being blown up and children buried under rubble, obviously it's incredibly distressing. But I think it's going to turn into a much more complicated issue for people once they see how it's impacting their everyday lives, I think.
And do you think ultimately, Joe, footballers might just be asked to shut up? Because that's how it used to be, isn't it? Footballers focus on football, do that, stop trying to be a role model, and then there's no problem. Or are we past that now? Taking the knee, Black Lives Matter, Marcus Rashford, all of that is so part of the bloodstream of football that actually they can't be silent, especially when they've got, Ukrainian teammates.
Well, yeah, as it turns out, it is impossible to keep politics out of football, which was the line from Conservative MPs a few months ago when the BLM movement was taking off. I find it slightly difficult to know what to do with this news, in the sense that the sport washing itself has already happened. You mentioned earlier, Ollie, that football fans at the moment are on side with these measures against Russian money in the Premier League. Chelsea football fans don't seem to be, or at least a sizable minority don't seem to be. You had last week during a Premier League match, there was a minute's applause in solidarity with Ukraine, and you had Chelsea fans chanting Roman Abramovich's name during the minute's applause. the issue is that the sporting industry and football specifically has allowed this to go on for an incredibly long time and is now trying to get its house in order because it realises it's aligned itself with very dangerous and autocratic individuals that have got close links to, a man who is now threatening the largest war in Europe since the 1940s. I don't quite see how football unpicks this relationship. And I think you can use the example of Newcastle United taking investment from the Saudi Wealth Fund recently. The difficulty is this process has gone. The horse has bolted on this one. I think it's very difficult now to row back to a time when football wasn't so entwined with these slightly nefarious individuals. And I don't realistically think that the sort of wave of morality we're seeing at the moment in the Premier League is going to stick for any amount of time.
Well, we have a phrase here that the most unimportant of all the important things is the third story in the show. And Felicity, you'll be giving us that after this. OK, Felicity, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The health crisis that will go down like a lead balloon.
This is lead. We don't really like lead. You see, it all goes back to a time when we thought we could be friends with lead. In fact, lead was even popular, invited into a whole range of everyday items like paint and gasoline. But over time, lead grew out of control and revealed a dark secret. It just can't stop poisoning people. So today, we've had enough. It's time to put lead to bed.
Why lead poisoning is a danger to your child's health, a short film from UNICEF. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Felicity, what's happened this week?
A rather remarkable study has been published this week that's found that exposure to leaded gasoline lowered the IQ of about half the population of the United States.
That's a big number.
It's a big number.
Half the population of the United States?
Yeah. It's been published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is peer-reviewed. And it's researchers from Florida State University and Duke University. And it's focusing on people born before 1996, which was the year that the US banned gas containing lead, when they'd sort of realised that it had these absolutely disastrous health implications. But overall, it's found that childhood lead exposure cost America an estimated 824 million points. That's about 2.6 points per person on average. It's pretty wild, really. I mean, it's sort of one of those stories that really does seem to fit the bill of this podcast very well, if I may say so myself, because I think for people who know about lead exposure, I mean, it really is such a huge health crisis, and yet we never seem to talk about it that much, really.
Because, I suppose, it's been going on so long?
Yeah, exactly. So I think a very sort of potted brief history of this is that lead was introduced to cars in the 1920s and sort of turned up in, Ford models, and it made cars more efficient. And so everyone was raving about it. And it's one of those stories where it's not really sort of evil big corporations who knew all along about this. I think that it wasn't sort of known for quite a long time just how bad lead was, but nonetheless, lead is a neurotoxin. No amount of it is safe, especially for children when their brains are developing. It has all sorts of terrible consequences. It affects your intelligence. It's associated with aggressivity, impulsivity, ADHD. Crime is the big one. There's been really kind of persuasive and compelling surveys to show that, violent crime would rise with people who'd had exposure to lead when they were growing up.
Okay.
So there's a lot going on.
So it sounds horrible, Emma, but if everyone's IQ was lowered by a few points, would you notice the difference? Because the comparatively higher IQ people would still be comparatively higher IQ than the comparatively lower IQ people who would still have comparatively lower IQ. It's just the whole dial was shifted down a bit. Will that have made a significant difference, do you think, to these people's lives?
Well, it may not have made sort of, for some people, too much of an impact on their individual lives. The principal study author, Michael McFarlane, said that in many cases the shift would have been nominal, 2 to 3 points, so won't have had a huge amount of impact on their individual lives. But the fact is that it's such a wide-ranging issue, so many millions of people affected that it is enough, and it has led to a huge sort of bell curve shift, as Felicity mentioned. And the fact is that a lot of people who will have been affected will be living in lower income areas, areas with lower infrastructure levels, which leads to the exposure to this. And those people are more likely to have lower IQ. And if you have lower IQ, then the 2 or 3 point reduction becomes more impactful. And so this will be it's one of those things where those who've been affected are the ones who can, least afford to have been affected.
Yeah, so as ever, Joe, it's staggering, isn't it? On every story in America, there's a sort of a racial element to it. But the idea behind it in this case would be, if you're from a socioeconomic background, that means you're more likely to be living closer to the road, you're more likely to be black than white. Therefore, this has had a racial impact as well.
Absolutely, and the racial impacts of these stories normally breaks down, as Emma said, because a high percentage of black Americans live in areas with poor infrastructure and in areas where socioeconomic issues are rife, which means that these things invariably play out in ways that impact them more.
Although if you live in Manhattan, you also live right by the road, don't you? If you live in a skyscraper, you're also in the middle of a smoggy city. So I imagine that must have affected all sorts of people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's also true. I think it's why this study is so staggering, because it is such a wide-ranging issue. It's worth noting that lead petrol was only banned in Britain in 2000. The ban has led to significant drops in levels of lead pollution, but a study published last year...
And we were all born before 2000, so all our IQs might be affected.
I was 5 years old and sucking in this dirty air. But, it's worth noting, research published last year found that there's heightened levels of lead in London's air even now, because of the fact that the ban was only brought into force 22 years ago. So it does slightly raise the question of, now that we have these statistics from the US study and they are as startling as they are, it does slightly raise the question of how this has impacted the global population. The world's last stocks of leaded petrol were used up in August 2021. So people have been driving around in cars that use lead petrol for decades, and it would be interesting to see the statistics on a global scale.
Yeah, and actually children in particular, Felicity, because Joe mentioned, being 5 years old, as if, compared to someone who'd been sucking it in for 50 or 60 years, perhaps that didn't have such an impact. But actually it is children that are affected, isn't it, particularly by lead poisoning? This video that you referred us to was from UNICEF. What's the impact?
It's huge, really, because it just sort of has like lifelong implications. It's sort of like a lifelong thing, basically. So exposure from a child when your brain is developing, it means it's almost sort of like a permanent change that, that can't really be altered. And also just going back to the point about crime, violent crime in particular. So starting in the 1960s, America saw a huge increase in levels of violent crime that peaked in the early 1990s and then steadily declined. And that correlates almost precisely with more and more people inhaling leaded gas, and then it's sort of tailing off once policies came in to prevent people from having lead. So even the idea that criminality, as if you were a toddler ingesting loads and loads of leaded gas as a small child, that could actually have implications for whether you would turn into an aggressive criminal later on is completely fascinating, and there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that's true. And I think it's such an interesting story, because it's the idea that you like to think of yourselves as having autonomy as a human. You make decisions about whether you're going to do criminal things later on in life. What happens if there are forces beyond our control, like lead and petrol that we hadn't considered, that kind of affects the outcome of our lives and society as a whole?
It's worth noting as well that this lead in gasoline hasn't just led to IQ problems, it's led to a whole range of other physical issues too. Article by NBC on this topic spoke about how a greater number of physical issues such as heart and kidney disease have been linked to this through these studies. So it's a wide-ranging health issue. It's not just to do with IQ.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that exposure to lead is something that, the US population specifically, but also the kind of global environmental population are very aware of, because it obviously evokes the Flint water crisis, which began in 2014 and lasted until 2019 and actually still isn't fully cleared up. That saw 6,000 to 12,000 children exposed to drinking water with high levels of lead. So we've got a pretty good idea of how these things play out. The types of things Felicity's been talking about, loss of intellectual function, increased chances of Alzheimer's disease, precisely because we have this sort of horrific data set from Flint. And so, that experience of what happened in Flint, Michigan should really set off alarm bells when you then realise the extent to which people have been breathing in lead-infused air for decades.
But that's the issue, isn't it? You often don't get scientific data that's robust enough to act upon legally for decades. And Felicity, this is the problem perhaps with kind of green-related scare stories generally. You can catastrophize now, but by the time you have the proof, you're basically dead. And there's another thing for people to worry about. It's very difficult. You get to this stage now, people hear this story and they say, oh, my IQ is a little bit lower than it should be, is it? Oh, well, shrug. Nothing I can do about that now.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is that the time lapse with this story that makes it difficult to believe and kind of impossible to work out what to do next. It's hard for people to see the link between cause and effect when it's like 20-year gap between you having the lead inside your body and then seeing what comes of it 20 years later down the line. And I guess that's not really how we work in today's modern society generally. We sort of very instantaneous. We want our information now. We want the results now, or we want the action now. We're not going to wait for 20 years to kind of see. And I suppose with climate change, we don't really have 20 years. We kind of do need to act quite swiftly. But yeah, that is the problem. I mean, this does throw out by the time you have the reliable evidence and the correlation, and also just the sheer amount of sort of dogged research that people have had to do to work out that lead is responsible for this. It has just taken a really, really long period of time, and it hasn't also really broken through as a huge story. So to end on a bit of a depressing note, it doesn't really bode well for other huge, looming crises like climate change.
Right. Well, rather than all of us sit here feeling our IQ deteriorating as we speak, I'm going to wrap things up there. My thanks to Emma, Felicity and Joe for their stories. We will be back next week. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Whatever your IQ, it's easy. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And do remember to check out our new sister show, The Overview, from the week as well. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.